The final rejection echoed in the cavernous hall, a soundless thunderclap that vibrated through the marble floor and up into Seraphina's bones. Lord Emmerich of the Sunstone Cliffs, a man whose jaw could have been carved from his own quarries, took one look at her and sneered. A silent Omega? His voice was a gravelly insult. You would offer me a broken vessel for a bride? Seraphina stood on the dais, a ghost in a borrowed gown of pale silk. She did not flinch. She had learned long ago that stillness was her only shield. Her older sister Isolde stepped forward, her own gown a slash of crimson against the hall's muted tapestries. A perfect smile was painted on her lips, a cruel work of art. My lord, you misunderstand, Isolde said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. My sister is not broken. She is quiet, a virtue in a wife, some might say. The lie was as thin as spun glass, broken. The word was not new. It had been whispered in her ear since childhood, a lullaby of inadequacy. Seraphina had been born into a world of sound and fury, a world of shifters whose howls declared their lineage and whose growls settled disputes. She possessed none of it. No voice had ever passed her lips. Not a cry at birth, not a word as a child, not a scream of terror or a sigh of pleasure. She was a void where a voice should be, a silent Omega. Lord Emmerich laughed, a short barking sound that made the courtiers around him titter nervously. I need a wife whose voice can command a household, not a decorative statue. Your family insults me with this offering. Her father, his face a mask of strained pride, bowed his head. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on Seraphina's shoulders. She felt the stares of 100 nobles, each gaze a tiny pinprick against her skin. They saw what Lord Emmerich saw. Worthless, defective, a broken thing. Inside her, where her voice should have been, something else resided. She called it the soul song. It was a quiet hum, a vibration that allowed her to feel the emotions of others as if they were colors in the air. Right now, the hall was a churning mess of ugly browns and sharp, acidic yellows, contempt, pity, morbid curiosity. Her sister's soul song was a venomous green, shot through with the triumphant red of her own success. Isolde had known this would happen. She had orchestrated it. By bringing Seraphina here, to the grand capital, Isolde had not been trying to find her a match. She had been demonstrating her own perfection by showcasing her sister's flaw. The family retreated from the dais in disgrace. Seraphina walked behind them, her head held high, her borrowed slippers making no sound on the polished stone. It was her one grace: silence. Later, in the cramped city apartments they had rented, the fury broke. You shamed us! Her father roared, his soul song a violent, pulsating scarlet. I should have left you in the woods as a babe. Her mother wept, her sorrow a watery, pathetic gray. Isolde watched from the corner, polishing a silver brooch, her satisfaction a cool, metallic blue. Seraphina simply went to the small window and looked out over the city. The royal palace dominated the skyline, its dark spires clawing at the bruised twilight sky. The onyx citadel, home of King Caspian, the Alpha King. His name was a curse whispered in taverns and a prayer of terror uttered by his enemies. They said he was more beast than man, a ruler forged in ice and shadow whose cruelty was legendary. They said he was searching for a queen, but no woman could withstand him. He held a trial of silence. A candidate would be brought before him, and she had but one task: to remain silent in his presence, to not scream. None had succeeded. They were carried out broken, their minds shattered by whatever horror they witnessed in his throne room. A sudden, terrible idea bloomed in the air, planted by the cold, calculating mind of her sister. "Father," Isolde said, her voice cutting through their father's rage, "there is still one way Serafina can serve this family." Her father stopped his pacing. "What are you saying?" "The king's trial," Isolde said, her eyes glinting. "He requires a woman who can endure his presence without screaming." A chilling silence fell over the room. Serafina's own heart, a frantic bird in her chest, seemed to still. Isolde smiled, her masterpiece of a plan finally revealed. "Our Serafina has never made a sound in her life." Who better to face the Alpha King? It was not a suggestion. It was a death sentence. A way to be rid of the broken thing and perhaps, if by some impossible miracle she survived, to gain favor with the crown. Her father's greedy, desperate soul song shifted from red anger to a sickening shade of hopeful gold. He looked at Serafina not as a daughter, but as a final, desperate gambit, a tool to be used and discarded. Serafina felt nothing. Resignation was an old, familiar cloak. She had been a ghost in her own family for years. Now they would send her to face a monster, hoping her silence, her lifelong curse, would be her one and only virtue. She closed her eyes, the cacophony of her family's emotions fading away. In the quiet center of her being, her own soul song was a single, unwavering note of pure, crystalline blue. It was the color of endurance. It was the color of stone at the bottom of a river, waiting for the torrent to pass. They could send her to the beast's den. They could throw her away. But she would not break. Her silence was her shield. And perhaps, in the court of a terrifying king, it would also be her sword. The throne room of the Onyx Citadel was a study in intimidation. Shadows clung to the vaulted ceiling like roosting bats. The walls were hewn from black, volcanic rock that seemed to drink the light from the high, narrow windows. At the far end, upon a throne that looked more like a jagged mountain peak than a seat of power, sat nothing but an absence. The king was not yet present. Serafina stood in the center of the room, the heavy doors having boomed shut behind her. Her family had left her at the gate, their farewells as cold and perfunctory as the morning air. Isolde had pressed a final kiss to her cheek, a viper's touch, whispering, "Try not to disappoint us for once." Now she was alone. The court was assembled, lining the walls. Warriors in dark gray armor, their faces grim and scarred. Courtiers in somber silks, their expressions a mixture of morbid anticipation and fear. Their collective soul song was a murky, nervous fog, thick with dread. They were all waiting for the show. They were waiting for her to break. A guard with a face like a closed fist stood near the door. "The rules of the trial are simple," he announced, his voice echoing in the oppressive silence. "Do not speak. Do not cry out. Do not scream. Endure." Serafina inclined her head in a gesture of understanding. "Do not scream." The irony was a bitter pill in her throat. She could not scream if the world was ending. A heavy door scraped open to the side of the throne, and a new presence entered the room. The change in the atmosphere was instantaneous. The nervous fog of the court's emotion curdled into pure, stark terror. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. King Caspian entered his throne room. He was not what she had expected. The whispers had painted a picture of a gnarled beast, a twisted monster. The man who strode towards the throne was tall and brutally powerful, moving with the fluid grace of a stalking predator. His hair was as black as the stone of his castle, and his eyes were the color of a winter storm, a piercing silver gray that missed nothing. A jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a white line against his stern, unyielding face. But it was his soul song that struck her dumb. It was a maelstrom, a vortex of howling, black agony, and razor-sharp edges of silver rage. It was the sound of a soul being torn apart, a constant, silent scream of such profound loneliness and pain that it made her own silent world feel like a peaceful sanctuary. This was not a monster. This was a man in unimaginable torment. He settled onto his throne, the motion economical and severe. His gaze swept over the court, and everyone, even the most hardened warriors, flinched and looked away. Then his eyes landed on her. The storm in his soul seemed to focus, the full force of his presence crashing down on her like a physical blow. It was overwhelming, it was terrifying. It was designed to shatter the will, to provoke a primal scream of fear. The women before her must have felt this pressure, this raw, untamed power, and their minds had simply snapped. Serafina did not look away. She could not. She was transfixed by the sheer tragedy of his soul song. She saw past the terrifying Alpha King and saw the prisoner trapped within. Her own heart ached in sympathy. For the first time in her life, she wished for a voice, not to scream, but to soothe, to tell him that she heard his silent pain, that he was not alone in his soundless prison. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The court held its breath. King Caspian leaned forward slightly, a frown creasing his brow. He was waiting. The air grew thick, charged with a power that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She could feel it gathering in his chest, a prelude to the roar that had broken so many others. And still, she met his gaze. Her expression was not one of defiance. It was one of understanding, of compassion. A flicker of something new entered his turbulent soul song, a sliver of silver confusion. He had expected terror. He had expected a shrieking, fainting mess. He had not expected this quiet, unbroken girl who looked at him as if she could see the shards of his soul. He stood abruptly. The movement was so sudden that a collective gasp went through the court. He descended the steps of the dais, his heavy boots echoing like funeral bells. He stopped a mere foot in front of her. He was a mountain of a man, and she had to crane her neck to look up at him. His proximity was suffocating. The storm of his soul was all around her now, a tempest of raw power and pain. Any other woman would have collapsed. Serafina stood her ground. She held his gaze, her own soul song a steady, unwavering blue. He lifted a hand, and she saw that his fingers were long and calloused, the hand of a warrior. He reached out, not to strike her, but to gently cup her chin. His touch was unexpectedly warm, a stark contrast to the icy chill of his reputation. He tilted her head up, studying her face with an intensity that felt like it was peeling back the layers of her being. His thumb brushed against her lips. "You are not afraid," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through her jaw. It was not a question. It was a statement of disbelief. Serafina could only offer the truth in her eyes. "I am not afraid of you. I am afraid for you." He saw something there, something that made the storm in his soul quiet for a single, breathtaking moment. A fragile calm settled in the eye of the hurricane. He dropped his hand and turned to face the stunned court. "The trial is over," he commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. A man in dark robes, an advisor with a thin, cruel face, stepped forward. His soul song was a slimy, coiling serpent of ambition and deceit. "Your Majesty?" the advisor, Lord Malachor, asked. "She has not yet broken." The king's gaze was glacial. "She has not. And she will not." He turned back to Serafina. "She is not to be a candidate," he declared, his words echoing off the black stone. She is to be a servant. In my private chambers. Effective immediately. The shock in the room was a palpable wave. He had not killed her. He had not broken her. He had claimed her. Not as a queen, but as something else. Something personal. Lord Malacor's serpent-like soul song hissed with frustration and surprise. King Caspian gestured to a guard. Escort her. See that she is given quarters near my own. Without another glance at his court, the Alpha King turned and swept from the room, the tempest of his soul roaring back to life as he departed. Seraphina was left standing in the center of the throne room, the focus of 100 bewildered and envious stares. She had survived the trial, but she had a sinking feeling that her true test had only just begun. She had walked into the beast's den, and the beast, for reasons she could not comprehend, had decided to keep her. The king's private chambers were a world away from the oppressive grandeur of his throne room. They were stark, masculine, and deeply lonely. A massive bed draped in black furs, a table littered with maps and military dispatches, and a vast stone fireplace, its hearth cold and empty. This was her new domain. Her duties were simple. She was to keep the rooms tidy, tend the fire, and be present when the king retired for the evening. She was a glorified ghost, tasked with haunting the loneliest man in the kingdom. The other servants treated her with a mixture of fear and contempt. They were terrified of the king, and by extension, they were terrified of the strange, silent girl he had inexplicably spared. A sour-faced head housekeeper named Griselda seemed to take a particular dislike to her. Griselda's soul song was a curdled yellow of jealousy and spite. "Don't think you're special, little mute," Griselda had hissed on her first day, shoving a bucket of coal into her hands. "He'll tire of his new pet soon enough. And then, he'll break you, just like all the others." Seraphina ignored her. The woman's petty cruelty was a gnat's buzz compared to the hurricane of the king's pain. Caspian himself was a distant, brooding presence. He would enter his chambers late at night, exhausted from the duties of his crown. He rarely looked at her. He never spoke to her. But she felt his awareness of her in the room. It was a constant, low hum beneath the storm of his soul song. Her presence seemed to soothe him in some small way. When she was there, kneeling by the hearth and coaxing a blaze to life, the violent edges of his inner tempest seemed to soften slightly. He would sit in a large, worn leather chair by the fire, staring into the flames, and a fragile peace would settle over the room. One evening, a week into her strange new life, the chill of autumn had deepened into the bite of winter. Seraphina wore the simple gray wool of a servant, a thin garment that offered little protection against the castle's drafts. She shivered as she knelt to add another log to the fire. She did not realize the king was watching her until a heavy weight settled over her shoulders. She looked up in surprise. Caspian stood over her, his expression unreadable. He had draped his own heavy, fur-lined cloak around her. It was impossibly warm, and it smelled of pine, cold air, and the unique, wild scent of the king himself. It was an act of unexpected kindness, a small, gentle current in the midst of his soul's raging sea. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a gratitude she could not voice. He met her gaze, and for a moment, the storm in his silver-gray eyes stilled. "You are too thin for the cold of this castle," he said, his voice a low rumble. He did not move away. He simply stood there looking down at her, wrapped in his cloak. The intimacy of the moment was a shocking jolt. His inner wolf, the primal core of his alpha nature, was suddenly at the forefront of his soul song. It was a powerful, possessive presence, a silver wolf that recognized something in her. Mine. The thought was not hers. It was a projection from him, so strong and clear it felt like a word spoken aloud in her mind. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was dangerous territory. He was a king. She was a silent servant, a rejected Omega. She quickly looked down, breaking the eye contact, and focused on her task, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the logs. Caspian let out a sigh that sounded like the grating of stone on stone. He moved to his chair, the moment broken. But the cloak remained around her shoulders, a silent claim. The next day, Griselda saw her with the cloak. The housekeeper's face twisted into a mask of pure venom. "So, the little mute warms the king's bed now, does she?" Griselda spat, cornering her in the linen closet. Serafina shook her head, trying to push past. Griselda grabbed her arm, her fingers digging in like talons. "You think you're better than us? You're nothing but a freak, a silent little witch." The woman's hateful yellow soul song was suffocating. Suddenly, a shadow fell over them. "Release her." The king's voice was not loud. It was deadly quiet. Griselda froze, her face draining of all color. She snatched her hand back from Serafina's arm as if it had been burned. Caspian stood in the doorway of the closet, his presence filling the small space entirely. His gaze was fixed on Griselda, and it was colder than a winter tomb. The storm in his soul was raging, a black and silver inferno of protective fury. "She is under my personal protection," Caspian said, each word a chip of ice. "If you or any other servant lays a hand on her again, you will be thrown from the highest tower of this citadel. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Griselda stammered, bowing so low her head nearly touched her knees. "Get out of my sight." The housekeeper scrambled away, her soul song a quivering mess of terror. Serafina was left alone with the king. He stepped closer, his gaze softening as it fell on the red marks Griselda's fingers had left on her arm. He reached out, his touch incredibly gentle as his thumb traced the marks. "Did she hurt you?" he asked softly. Serafina shook her head. The physical pain was nothing, but his concern, his ferocious protection, that was a blow that struck deep inside her. No one had ever defended her before. No one had ever looked at her as if she were something precious to be guarded. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. She would not cry. Caspian's expression was pained. "I wish," he began, then stopped, frustration tightening his jaw. "I wish you could speak to me." He wanted to know her thoughts. He wanted to hear her voice. And she wanted, more than anything, to give it to him. To tell him thank you. To tell him that his kindness was a balm on a lifetime of wounds. To tell him that she heard the screams of his soul and wished she could silence them. But she could not. She could only look at him, her heart in her eyes, and hope he understood. That night, as she tended the fire in his chambers, he did not sit in silence. He began to talk. He spoke of the burdens of his crown, of the betrayals in his court, of the constant crushing weight of his power. He didn't seem to expect a response. He was simply unburdening himself, speaking his loneliness into the quiet space she provided. Serafina listened, not with her ears, but with her soul. She felt the truth of his words, the deep ache of his isolation. He was surrounded by people, yet he was utterly alone, trapped by a curse she was beginning to understand was tied to his voice, his power, his terrifying alpha roar. The very thing that made him king was also his cage. He fell silent, staring into the flames. The air between them was thick with unspoken things. A dangerous intimacy was growing in the firelight, a bond forged in shared silence and mutual pain. His inner wolf was watching her, its silver eyes gleaming in the depths of his soul. It was no longer just a flicker of recognition. It was a steady, possessive hum. Mate. The word echoed again in the space between them, stronger this time. A terrifying, beautiful, impossible truth. Her own inner spirit, a quiet, resilient thing she had never thought of as a wolf, stirred in response. It recognized him too. Her rational mind screamed in protest. This could lead nowhere but to ruin. But the quiet, lonely part of her that had been silent for so long yearned to answer his soul's call. She was falling for the cursed king, and she feared it would be the one thing that truly broke her. The moon was a perfect silver disk in the ink-black sky, spilling its light over the castle's private garden. It was a secret place, a small haven of white roses and fragrant night-blooming jasmine, hidden deep within the citadel's stone heart. Caspian had led her here. After weeks of fireside confessions and shared, silent moments, he had taken her hand one evening and simply said, "Walk with me." Now they stood by a marble fountain, the soft sound of trickling water the only noise besides their breathing. The air was cool and sweet. For the first time since she had arrived, Seraphina felt a sense of peace. Caspian's soul song was different out here. The raging storm was still present, a distant thunder on the horizon of his soul. But here, in the moonlight, a new melody was rising. It was a deep, resonant chord of yearning, so powerful it made her own soul ache in response. He had been quiet for a long time, simply watching her as she reached out to touch the petal of a moon-kissed rose. "You are the only quiet thing in my world," he said finally, his voice soft, almost reverent. He turned to face her fully, taking both of her hands in his. His hands were large and warm, completely engulfing hers. "Before you came, my life was a constant roar," he continued, his silver eyes searching her face. "The demands of the court, the clang of steel, the screams of my enemies, and the storm inside my own head." He squeezed her hands gently. "But when you are near, there is peace. Your silence is not an absence, it is a presence. It is a balm to my soul." Her heart felt as if it would beat its way out of her chest. She knew where this was going. She could feel the intention building in him, a wave of emotion that was both thrilling and terrifying. "The trial," he said, a look of self-loathing crossing his face. It was a desperate, cruel measure. "I was told I needed a queen of immense strength, one who would not shatter under the weight of my condition." He looked away, towards the dark spires of his own castle. They were all so loud. Their fear was a shriek that only fed the beast inside me. But you met my rage with stillness. You looked at me, and you were not afraid." He turned back to her, his gaze intense, burning. "I did not understand it then. But I do now. My wolf knew from the moment you walked into that throne room. My soul recognized yours." He lifted one of her hands to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. The contact sent a shiver through her entire body. "Seraphina," he murmured, the first time he had ever used her name. It sounded like a prayer on his lips. "My soul calls to yours. My wolf claims you. You are my mate." The words hung in the moonlit air, beautiful and deadly. Mate. The truth of it resonated deep within her, a perfect harmony with her own soul song. Yes, he was hers. She was his. It was a fact as undeniable as the moon in the sky. "Be my queen," he pleaded, his voice raw with a vulnerability she had never heard from him before. "Rule by my side." Let your silence be the anchor that holds my storm at bay. Say, you will be mine. He was asking for a verbal answer she could not give, but he was also asking for her heart, her future, her everything. And every instinct, every fiber of her being screamed yes. But then, the fear followed. A cold, rational dread that extinguished the warmth in her veins. He saw her silence as strength, but she knew the truth. It was a defect, a flaw, a brokenness. How could she be a queen? A queen needed a voice to command, to counsel, to rule. She had none. And what of his curse? She had felt it. A dark, festering magic coiled around his soul. It was tied to his power, to his roar. Binding herself to him, a weak and broken Omega, would not anchor him. It would drag him down. Her flaw would become his liability. Her presence would not save him. It would doom him. The court already whispered about her. Lord Malachor, with his serpent soul, watched their growing closeness with a hateful jealousy. If she became queen, she would be a target. And through her, they would destroy him. She could not do that to him. She loved him too much to be the cause of his downfall. The pain of this realization was a physical blade twisting in her gut. She had to reject him, for his own sake. His face was alight with hope, his turbulent soul for once clear and bright with yearning. To say no would be to plunge him back into that storm, darker and more violent than before. It was the cruelest thing she would ever have to do. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and traitorous. She pulled her hands from his grasp. She took a step back, and then another. She looked him in the eye, and with all the strength she possessed, she shook her head. Number. The light in his eyes died. It was as if a candle had been snuffed out, leaving only smoke and darkness behind. The hope in his soul song shattered into a million piercing shards of silver pain. Confusion warred with agony on his face. Why? He whispered, the word broken. I do not understand. I feel the bond between us. I know you feel it too. She could not explain. She could only inflict the wound and pray it would save him in the end. She shook her head again, more forcefully this time. She took another step back, turning her rejection into a retreat. The hurt on his face hardened, calcifying into the cold, impenetrable mask of the Alpha King. The walls went back up, higher and thicker than ever before. The storm in his soul returned, a howling blizzard of rejection and fury. I see, he said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. I was mistaken. He turned his back on her, a gesture of dismissal more absolute than any command. You are returned to your former duties. Leave my sight. I do not wish to see you again. The words were like stones, each one striking her with brutal force. With a final heartbroken glance at his rigid back, Seraphina turned and fled the garden. She ran through the cold, echoing hallways of the castle, tears now streaming freely down her face. She had done the right thing. The only thing she could do to protect him. So why did it feel like she had just torn out her own heart and left it bleeding on the cold marble of the moonlit garden? She had cast herself out of his light, back into the shadows. And in doing so, she had left him more alone than ever before. The banishment was absolute. Seraphina was cast back into the anonymous drudgery of the lower servants. She was assigned to the scullery, a damp, perpetually gray place that smelled of stale grease and lye soap. Her hands, which had so recently been held by a king, were now raw and chapped from scrubbing blackened pots. Griselda lorded her victory over her, a triumphant, ugly smirk never leaving her face. Told you he'd tire of his pet, the housekeeper sneered daily. You aimed for the throne, little mute, and ended up in the muck, where you belong." Serafina bore the taunts in silence. They were nothing compared to the gnawing emptiness inside her. The castle felt different now. The fragile peace she had brought to the king was gone, and the entire citadel seemed to groan under the weight of his renewed despair. His soul song was a constant, distant torment. The storm was back, worse than ever, a relentless hurricane of pain and rage that she could feel even from the lowest levels of the castle. She had broken him. She had broken them both. Days bled into a miserable week. She caught glimpses of him from a distance. He looked harder, colder. The scar on his face seemed more prominent, his silver eyes like chips of ice. He never looked her way. It was as if she had ceased to exist. Lord Malachor, however, was thriving. The king's advisor was constantly at his side, his slimy, serpent-like soul coiling possessively around the king's raging one. Serafina watched from the shadows as Malachor whispered in Caspian's ear, his words like poison dripping into an open wound. She could feel the wrongness of it. Malachor was not comforting the king. He was stoking the flames of his pain, feeding the darkness, isolating him further. He was taking advantage of the rift she had created. One afternoon, while she was hauling a bucket of dirty water across the main courtyard, a commotion erupted from the direction of the king's war council chambers. Shouts, a crash of breaking furniture, and then a roar. It was not a sound of command. It was a raw, uncontrolled explosion of agony and power. The very stones of the courtyard seemed to vibrate with it. Guards and servants scrambled away in terror. Serafina dropped her bucket, her gaze fixed on the high windows of the council room. Caspian's soul song flared, a supernova of black and silver pain, so intense it made her stagger. Then, it faltered. It weakened, dimming like a dying star. Something was terribly wrong. Guards came rushing out of the citadel, their faces pale with panic. "The king has collapsed," one of them yelled. "Fetch the royal physician." Serafina's blood ran cold. She pushed through the panicked crowd, her small frame slipping through gaps, driven by a desperate need to get closer. She reached the entrance hall just as they were carrying him out. Caspian was unconscious on a litter, his face ashen, his breathing shallow. The immense, formidable power that usually radiated from him was gone, replaced by a terrifying fragility. Lord Malachor followed the litter, his face a mask of false concern, but his soul song was a writhing knot of triumphant, venomous green. He did this. The certainty struck her with the force of a physical blow. Malachor had used Caspian's pain, the pain she had caused, as a weapon against him. He had somehow amplified the curse, turning it inward to devour the king's life force. As the procession passed, Malachor's cold, calculating eyes met hers. He saw the knowing accusation in her gaze. A slow, cruel smile touched his lips. He had won. And he knew that she knew. Later that day, the castle was in chaos. The physicians could do nothing. The king was fading, trapped in a magical coma, consumed by a fever that no remedy could touch. Serafina was scrubbing a floor, her mind numb with grief and guilt, when the guards came for her. Two of them, their faces grim, flanked by a sneering Lord Malachor. "Serafina of the Silent Wood," Malachor announced, his voice ringing with theatrical authority. "You stand accused of treason and the practice of dark witchcraft." Her head snapped up. The other servants in the scullery shrank back, their fear and suspicion a suffocating wave. "We have evidence," Malachor continued, holding up a small, crudely made doll of black cloth, pierced with a silver pin. A lock of dark hair was tied around its neck, Caspian's hair. "A poppet, found hidden in your meager belongings. You wove a spell to enchant the king, to gain his favor. When he rejected your advances, you turned your foul magic against him, striking him down. It was a lie. A perfectly crafted, damnable lie. Griselda stood behind Malachor, her face a mixture of fear and vindictive pleasure. She had planted it. "She is a witch!" Griselda shrieked, pointing a trembling finger. "She never speaks!" "It's unnatural. She bewitched him with her silent ways." The accusation spread like wildfire. It made a twisted kind of sense to the fearful, superstitious staff. The strange, mute girl who had captured the king's attention, only for him to fall ill after he cast her aside. "Seize her," Malachor commanded. The guards grabbed her arms, their grips like iron. She didn't struggle. What was the use? She had no voice to defend herself, no one to speak for her. As they dragged her from the scullery, she saw the faces of the other servants. She saw fear, hatred, and a grim satisfaction that the freak was finally getting her due. They hauled her through the castle, her bare feet scraping on the cold stone floors. Malachor walked beside her, his serpent soul pulsing with smug victory. "A pity," he murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "He truly cared for you. Your rejection wounded him so deeply it made my work laughably easy. His heart was already broken. I merely stopped it from beating." He was confessing, boasting of his crime to the one person who could never repeat it. They threw her into the dungeons. The cell was a lightless, dripping hole, the air thick with the smell of despair. The iron door slammed shut, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing her doom. She was alone in the dark. The king was dying, and she was sentenced to be executed. Malachor, acting as regent in the king's incapacitation, had decreed it himself. She was to be burned as a witch in the public square at dawn. She sank to the damp stone floor, wrapping her arms around her knees. This was her fault. Her fear, her misguided attempt to protect him, had given his true enemy the opening he needed. She had rejected him to save him, and in doing so, had handed him to his murderer. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. She had reached her lowest point. There was no escape. At dawn, she would burn, and the king she loved would die, his name slandered, his kingdom stolen by a traitor. Unless a tiny, defiant spark ignited in the depths of her soul. She was not a witch. She was not a freak. She was a silent omega, and she had a power no one understood. Not a voice to speak, but a song to be felt. Her soul song. It had never been a weapon. It had always been a shield, a way to perceive, to understand. But what if she could use it? What if she could push it out? Not just as a passive perception, but as an active force. A wave of pure, undeniable truth. It was a desperate, impossible idea. It would take every ounce of strength, every fiber of her being. It might even destroy her. But as she sat in the suffocating darkness, she knew it was her only hope. Not just to save herself, but to save him. She would face the flames, and she would sing her silent song. The dawn broke gray and merciless, the sky the color of dirty dishwater. A cold, damp wind whipped through the public square, carrying with it the jeers and murmurs of the assembled crowd. They had dragged her from the dungeon and chained her to a rough wooden pyre in the center of the square. The kindling was piled high around her ankles. She stood tall, her simple gray dress fluttering in the wind, her face pale but resolute. She scanned the crowd. They were a sea of hostile faces, their collective soul song a muddy, chaotic blend of fear, morbid excitement, and self-righteous anger. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted the witch to burn. Lord Malachor stood on a raised platform radiating smug authority. To his side, propped up in a large ornate chair and flanked by guards, was the king. Her heart broke at the sight of him. Caspian was barely conscious, his head lolling to the side, his skin slick with feverish sweat. He was a ghost of the powerful man he had been, his life force a flickering, guttering candle flame. Malachor had brought him here to witness her death, a final cruel twist of the knife. "Let this be a lesson." Malachor's voice boomed across the square, amplified by the unnatural silence. "This is the fate of those who use dark magic to threaten the crown. The witch will be purified by fire." A guard approached the pyre with a lit torch. This was it. Her final moment. Seraphina closed her eyes. She shut out the noise of the crowd, the cold wind on her skin, the acrid smell of the torch. She turned her focus inward, seeking the quiet, crystalline blue note at the center of her being, her soul song. For her entire life, she had held it inside. It was her secret, her sanctuary. Now she had to let it go. She gathered all of her love for Caspian, all of her grief, her guilt, her desperate yearning for justice. She poured every ounce of her life's silent suffering and her soul's unwavering strength into that single, pure note. And then she pushed. She did not scream. She unleashed. It was not a sound. It was a wave. A silent, luminous tsunami of pure emotion and truth that erupted from her, washing over the entire square. The crowd gasped as one. The jeers died in their throats. Every single person was struck by the raw, unfiltered truth of her soul. They felt her innocence. They felt her terror. Most of all, they felt her profound, heartbreaking love for their dying king. The guard with the torch froze, his hand trembling, the flame flickering as if in a gale. On the platform, Malachor staggered back, his face a mask of shock and rage. Her silent song was anathema to his deceit. The truth of it was like acid on his lies, burning away the glamour of his authority. The wave of her soul washed over the king's chair. It struck Caspian. It did not heal the magical poison that was killing him, but it cut through the feverish delirium, through the dark web of Malachor's spell. It was a clarion call to his own fading soul. "Caspian, wake up! He betrayed you." His eyes, which had been dull and unfocused, snapped open. For a single, lucid moment, the silver fire was back. He saw her, chained to the pyre. He saw Malachor, his face twisted in fury. And in the silent song that filled the air, he finally understood everything. Her rejection in the garden had not been out of malice. It had been a desperate, misguided act of protection. This, her facing the flames for him, was her true answer. This was her love. "Witch!" Malachor shrieked, his composure finally shattering. The serpent of his soul was rearing back, exposed and panicked. "She is casting another spell. Burn her now." He drew a wicked-looking dagger from his robes, its blade coated in a black, viscous poison. Since the guard would not act, he would kill her himself. He lunged towards the pyre. "No!" The word was a roar, a sound of pure, primal fury. Fueled by the truth of her song and the adrenaline of her peril, Caspian surged to his feet. The chains on the manacles binding him to the chair shattered like glass. He took a deep breath. The curse within him, the uncontrolled, destructive power of his alpha roar, swelled in his chest. But this time, it was different. Seraphina's soul song was still pouring through him, a guiding current of light and love. It wrapped around the storm in his soul, not containing it, but focusing it, giving it purpose. When he opened his mouth, It was not a wave of mindless destruction that erupted. It was a focused, concentrated blast of pure, unadulterated power, a spear of sound and force. It did not hit the crowd. It did not shatter the stones. It flew straight and true, guided by his love for her, and struck Lord Malachor square in the chest. The traitor's dark magic, the very spell that was killing the king, was instantly obliterated. Malachor was thrown backward as if struck by lightning, his body slamming against the far wall of the square. He collapsed in a heap, his power neutralized, the serpent of his soul extinguished forever. A profound silence fell over the square. The curse, its anchor in Malachor's magic now destroyed, shattered. The storm in Caspian's soul vanished. For the first time in his life, there was quiet inside his own head. He was free, but his strength was spent. He swayed on his feet, the poison still in his system. He looked at Seraphina, his eyes filled with love and desperation. He had saved her from the traitor, but he could not reach her. He was dying. Seraphina saw it. Her silent song had given him the clarity to break the spell, but the poison remained. There was only one way. The final confirmation of the mate bond, a claiming. It had to be her. With a final, desperate surge of will, she focused her power not on the crowd, but on the iron chains that bound her. She poured her entire being into them, and with a groan of protesting metal, the old rusted links snapped. She was free. She stumbled from the pyre, her legs weak, and ran towards him. The crowd parted before her, their faces filled not with hatred but with awe. She reached the platform just as Caspian's knees buckled. She caught him, her small frame straining under his weight. She lowered him gently to the ground, cradling his head in her lap. He looked up at her, his breathing ragged. "Sarah," he whispered, his strength failing. She leaned down, ignoring the stunned gasps of the crowd. She pressed her lips to his. It was not a soft, gentle kiss. It was a desperate, fierce act of possession and claiming. As their lips met, the mate bond between them, which had been a fragile, shimmering thread, ignited into an unbreakable golden chain. Power surged from her into him, her pure, untainted life force, the strength of her unwavering soul, poured into his body, attacking the remnants of Malachor's poison. It was a fire that burned away the darkness, cleansing him from the inside out. Color returned to his face. His breathing deepened, steadied. He gripped her arms, his strength returning in a sudden, powerful rush. He pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, claiming her back with equal ferocity. In front of the entire kingdom, the silent Omega saved the Alpha King. When they finally broke apart, he looked at her, his silver eyes clear and bright, and filled with a love so profound it stole her breath. He rose to his feet, pulling her up with him. He turned to face his people, his arm wrapped securely around her waist, holding her to his side. Then he raised his head and roared his claim for all to hear. It was a sound of magnificent power, of triumph, of a king reborn. But it held no hint of the destructive curse. It was the sound of a true Alpha King, whole and healed, claiming his queen, his mate, his savior. 1 year later, the onyx citadel was unrecognizable. The oppressive black stone walls were now draped with vibrant tapestries of silver and blue, the colors of the new queen. Sunlight, once a stranger to these halls, now streamed through newly widened windows, illuminating rooms filled with chatter and even, on occasion, laughter. The court of fear was gone, replaced by a court of respect. The transformation was a direct reflection of its rulers. King Caspian was no longer the brooding, tormented storm. The breaking of his curse had unleashed the noble, compassionate leader who had been trapped within. He ruled with a strength tempered by a newfound wisdom, his silver eyes now warm and quick to smile, especially when they landed on his wife. And Queen Seraphina, the silent queen, was the heart of it all. She never regained a physical voice. She did not need one. Her power, the soul song that had once been her secret shame, was now her greatest gift. She moved through the court, and her silent presence brought peace, exposed deceit, and soothed grievances before they could fester into conflicts. She was loved by the people, a symbol of how a perceived weakness could be the greatest of strengths. Today was the first anniversary of their union, the day she had faced the pyre and saved them all. It was being celebrated as the Day of the Soul Song, a kingdom-wide holiday. Seraphina stood on the balcony overlooking the main square, the same square where she had once been sentenced to die. Now it was filled with cheering citizens, their collective soul song a joyous, brilliant symphony of gold and pink and vibrant green. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned back into the solid warmth of her husband's chest. Caspian rested his chin on her shoulder, his own soul song a steady, deep blue of contentment, perfectly harmonized with her own. "They love you," a voice said, not in the air, but directly in her mind. It was his voice, a low, familiar rumble, a privilege of their completed mate bond. They no longer needed words. Their souls spoke to one another. She smiled, turning her head to kiss his cheek. "They love their king," she sent back, her own silent thought clear as a bell in his mind. "They love their king because he was saved by his queen," he corrected gently. "I love my king because he was saved by his queen." He turned her in his arms to face him, his expression earnest and filled with the same awe he'd held since that day. "I will spend the rest of my life making it up to you," he murmured aloud, for the benefit of any watching eyes, for the pain, the fear. She placed her fingers on his lips, shaking her head. "There is nothing to forgive," she thought to him. "It led us here." He took her hand, kissing her palm. "It did," he agreed, "and for that, I am eternally grateful." They stood for a long moment, simply looking at each other, their silent conversation more profound than any spoken words. The world saw a broken Omega who had captured a king. He saw the strongest soul he had ever known, the woman who had walked through fire and faced down his demons without making a sound. She saw not a terrifying alpha, but a man of deep honor and love, a man whose soul had called to hers from the very beginning. He had been a king cursed to a life of violent sound. She had been an Omega condemned to a life of absolute silence. Together, they had found the perfect harmony. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "My love, my mate, my queen, my king," she answered, her soul singing its reply. "My life, my home." And as the cheers of their healed kingdom rose up to meet them, they knew their song was only just beginning.